Hi, Faisal.
Hello.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
I'm very pleased to have this conversation with you. We had two previous video conference for the research workshop Iqbal, and we had many conversation off the record. It's always a great pleasure to exchange with you on different topics. You are an author, professor of history at the University of Oxford. So to start the discussion, I think that you two represent a sort of scholar that is really, you have lived in many countries. You are the sort of migrant yourself. So between you were raised in Africa, but you have you have different cultures. And I would like in the beginning that you talk about your itinerary between different countries, between different cultures, and also disciplines that after that led you to be a historian.
Yes, well, thank you, Radha. Always a pleasure to speak with you. In a way, there's nothing very exceptional about my background. It is shared with many millions of people, and it has become the norm rather than the exception, this moving around. So I am from a migrant Indian trading community, and therefore was born in East Africa. My family was based on the island of Zanzibar, which is an ancient port city, part of a very large trading network across the Indian Ocean and beyond. And so I was brought up in East Africa, and eventually my family moved to Canada sometime after the independence of the East African countries, when national movements there were becoming increasingly majoritarian in racial terms. And the Indian trading classes were rightly or wrongly being seen as exploiters, often using exactly the same language as that which characterized anti-Semitism in Europe. So it's quite interesting, the globalization and the movement not only of individuals and people, but of these conceptual forms of prejudice, like anti-Semitism, which came from Europe to characterize populations outside. In any case, I ended up in Canada, where I went to high school and college, and then I went to do my graduate study in the United States at the University of Chicago. I worked in the US for a while, and I eventually ended up in England. So that is my trajectory. And England, of course, is the place from which the dispersal of populations such as that to which my family belonged had been made possible. So it's not accidental that I should return to Britain, since apart from my American stay, all my travels and itinerary, as you put it, has been within the ex-British Empire, within the British Commonwealth. Again, a perfectly familiar thing. So new and not so new, because all I ended up doing was traversing the paths that had limbed the extent of the British Empire. And so here I am today at the center of the old empire.
No, it's very interesting to see that in your own personal itinerary, you already experimented different states of related to minority, to perceived the dominant minority, or the migrant, also the migrant category. So in your books you are working on these categories of caste, of class, of the Muslimness, and so on. And it's interesting that to see that you are also living what you are describing, but in terms of also dominant minority or dominant class, and also as exploited or discriminated category. So how have you been able to focus your teaching and your research, particularly on India, Pakistan, and this whole region?
Well, I suppose, on the one hand, of course, South Asia, India, Pakistan, these are places that were familiar because my family had come from there, and I still have relatives in India. So it was not a strange place, even though I did not have occasion to visit the subcontinent until much later, until the 1980s. So I had never been there, and my parents had never been there. My parents had also been born like me in East Africa. So it was familiar and yet quite strange. And when we moved to Canada, suddenly being from East Africa made no sense. It was a meaningless category initially. But there already existed populations, Indian populations in Canada, who had been there since the 19th century, particularly Sikh populations from the Punjab. And so we were willy-nilly assimilated into these Indian populations by others. We had our own relations with Sikhs and other groups from the subcontinent, but these groups dealt with each other as separate groups. They weren't homogenized in any way. They had their own religions, they had their own languages, they had their own cultures and their own histories. They were not clearly the same thing. But from the outside, we were all seen as the same thing, or practically the same thing. And I suppose, that was one reason why a kind of external form of identification allows you to, or forces you to think about what it means to be this person called an Indian, although the word on the street was often not Indian, and there were highly discriminatory words used for people of South Asian descent. And I think that is one of the things that made me interested in South Asia. Though I toyed with the idea of actually working on Africa, which would have been a much more personal trajectory or task for me, because I had been born there and grown up there. But I decided not to do so for several reasons, in part because I didn't want my intellectual work and academic interest to be defined entirely by who I was or where I came from. So I remain interested in East Africa, but my work has encompassed not only South Asia, but other parts of the Muslim world as well. And I'm interested not simply in, as it were, my background or my people. In fact, I don't look at them at all. I look at communities and groups and histories of which I myself am not, as it were, a part, nor my family for that matter. So I've written very little about the very specific history that produced me or my family or people like me. Only one article on East Africa is a gesture of homage, and that was an article on my president, the first Tanzanian president, Julius Nyerere, who had translated some of Shakespeare's plays into Kiswahili. So I looked at the translations of two of these plays, um, which were fantastic. I mean, the translations were amazing. But I looked at them in terms of, in the context of the politics of the new nation state that was Tanzania. And that was the only piece of work or research that I've dedicated to the country in which I was born and raised. Similarly, with my own sectarian Muslim background, I've spent very little time on it. But I've looked at, as it were, others, what interested me, and what has always interested me has been ideas primarily, but ideas in situations, produced within situations that are more or less familiar, but not entirely my own. So I should say perhaps that I'm interested in neighbors and friends. I'm interested in people among whom I live, and not just me. I think it's important for all of us to think about our neighbors and our surroundings and our friends, and even indeed our enemies. Who are they? Why are they the way they are? What does it mean to live amongst neighbors and friends and enemies in a world? And that has been the intent of my work, insofar as it takes in part as its subject something that is familiar to me historically or genealogically, or some place from which I can be said to have come. So there's familiarity, but I'm actually interested in the difference rather than the identity that characterizes this familiarity.
Faisal, your academic trajectory, your studies in the United States have given you the opportunity to explore or to deal in a way or another with what we call now the decolonial or post-colonial studies that are studies that also relied on the subaltern studies, and I wanted to know: have you been influenced by these set of ideas that also are emanating from scholars from the global South that have been teaching and working mainly in the United States, but not only there, in different universities from the north, and who have produced during the last 30, 40 years, a very interesting and new way of approaching social sciences with an inner critical look at the Western, domination on the social sciences. But I want to know, how do you deal with these theories? What do you take from this set, and what is your difference of approach with some of your colleagues?
Yeah. So when I was studying for my master's and PhD degrees at the University of Chicago, in the early 90s, the very end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, this was as it were, the golden period of post-colonialism. But the moment I use that term, I have to retract it, because today, the sense that that term possesses stands at variance with what I had understood it as being. So you mentioned subaltern studies, which was a school of Indian historians, many of whom, but not all of whom, ended up moving to the West, to places like Australia, if you can call that the West, and the United States primarily. And there were some among them who were, one or two who were British who were not Indian at all. And subaltern studies had been, the word subaltern is taken from Gramsci, uh, had been concerned with two things. One, the possibility of writing the histories of those deemed to be subaltern, those not part of an elite, a nationalist elite. So subaltern studies, which did not initially call itself post-colonial, was, in my view, a school of thought which dealt with the empire indirectly. Its main focus was the post-colonial nation state. Its main focus was nationalism. Its main target of critique was nationalism. And that focus seems to have been lost in our own day, when we tend to think about post-colonialism as being, as it were, a repetition of anti-colonial nationalism, as if it took the imperial state as its primary target. And this was, to my view, not the case at all. The nation state was seen to have inherited and even augmented or intensified some of the violence that characterized European imperial states. But it was clear that what posed itself as a problem to these scholars was the failure or the insufficiency of the nation state. But perhaps these are not the right words, because notions such as failure and insufficiency themselves characterize, as it were, imperial or orientalist forms of understanding non-European peoples, that they are somehow always marked by a lack, by an absence, by an insufficiency. They're never quite modern. They're never quite civilized enough. So these are the wrong words to use, probably. Now, what fascinated me about this school of thought was not so much its attempt to look at the histories and consciousness of, say, peasant populations or tribal populations who had become the victims of the nation state and its logic of development, so much as the incredible variety of sources that they brought to the scholarly table. So when you look at the essays in the Subaltern Studies, the journal that they edited, they were remarkable not only for their theoretical rigor, so they engage primarily with European and American high theory, if you will, which was really quite unlike older forms of Indian historiography. But they also brought to the table source materials which were previously unknown not because people didn't know they existed, but because they had not yet become part of historical study. So poetry in vernacular languages, novels, eventually cinema, other forms of culture. And this really revolutionized a whole way of writing history, which had until then been focused on the state and its bureaucratic character, and took as its evidence documents produced by the state, very often colonial documents. So, historians would make a regular pilgrimage as if they were going to Mecca or Benares. They would go to the British Library in London and look at all the documents that had been collected there. And that was how you did Indian history. Those documents were not necessarily all in English. They could be documents in Indian languages that had been collected by the British. But those were the documents that you had to look at. And what subaltern studies did, and what therefore post-colonialism did, was to completely break free of this constraint. They continue to use these documents, of course, and to this day, if you go to the British Library, you will see famous subaltern studies historians sitting there looking at the colonial documents. So it's not like they refused to consult them, but they really broadened the palette of material that could be looked at, and looked at in very distinctive ways. So they broke out of an older historical carapace in these ways, in terms of what counted as evidence, but also conceptually by reading, very often actually French thought, whether it was the work of Michel Foucault or of Jacques Derrida. So it could be historical, it could be philosophical, and weaving that into their own research. And that's what made it such an exciting field. Today, post-colonialism is subjected to criticisms of many kinds, and that's as it should be. It is a finished project in many ways. Subaltern studies certainly has come to an end. It has very deliberately and self-consciously, as it were, abolished itself. It no longer exists. And the same might, I suppose, be said for post-colonialism, except it's now been generalized into a kind of catch-all term that in countries like France, as you know better than I, has become a kind of term of abuse. Is seen as a form of thinking that is highly particularistic and racialized and all about identity politics and rejecting the universal categories of the Enlightenment or some such thing. These are all mythical ways of dealing with, and entirely unreal ways of dealing with post-colonialism. And such reality as they have probably emerged out of the transportation of groups or intellectual movements like subaltern studies to America, where they were redefined in this new context. And indeed, when subaltern studies was introduced to the American academic reading public, it was introduced to it in a volume called Selected Subaltern Studies, if I'm not mistaken, with an introduction by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and a kind of foreword by Edward Said. And so it came, as it were, with a knife already stuck in its back, because Gayatri Spivak had criticized subaltern studies, the very emphasis of subaltern studies, which was the recovery of the subaltern voice, which she thought was an impossible desire, and a highly violent desire at the same time, while Edward Said had, as it were, assimilated it to a more general or generalized struggle against Orientalism, which is, of course, the title of his own very famous book from 1979. And the subaltern studies historians often lent themselves to this new reading of their own work. As it were, they became famous, or they became part of a broader intellectual debate and even a political struggle that was quite different from what subaltern studies had meant in India itself before it was ascribed to Orientalism or recruited into a never-ending struggle against the consequences of colonialism. What was lost there was the nation state as its target of critique, which is really quite fascinating. It's extraordinary that this has happened. That so today in parts of the European continent, when you say post-colonialism, people don't even think that the target, the critical target, and the object of analysis is in fact the anti-colonial nation state. It is not the empire itself.
Yeah, your response is very dense and rich, but I have several remarks to make concerning what I appreciate is that you acknowledge that I mean, what these the subaltern studies and the colonial studies brought to the intellectual scene. I think it's important to value what you saw as a new historical material provided to researchers. Also, what seems to me important to focus is that, for instance, you mentioned that also these studies also were encouraging connections with other studies, with the French studies, because what is very instructive now is that in France now today these studies are rejected, perceived as partial, non-scientific, etc. But when you explore the historical roots of these studies, you see that they relied on the French studies that were promoted in the United States in the beginning of the 70s. Foucault, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, because there's a lot of deconstruction processes through these studies, Derrida and many others. So it is interesting to see that the French social scientists contributed to these studies, but today these studies are perceived as a sort of academic enemy. And what I think it's important also to mention is that for you, you are not like some other people that I know that are teaching in very famous universities in Europe and elsewhere. You are not pursuing this project of pointing the responsibility of the West, criticizing the West. I mean, there is also this I think the core thing is that it's a discourse that is also critical towards the West, but I'm not sure that it's always, at least today, in today's world, useful for the African societies, for Asian societies. I'm not sure that it reflects today a look at what is happening now, even though the subaltern studies provided new historical perspectives on history. And for you, to give you an example, I'm a native of Morocco. Morocco is a great country with a historical depth, that is fantastic. There were many empires in this region. Well, the history is very well documented, but it's always histories of states, of kings, of dynasties, but we have no idea of what was like to be a Moroccan peasant in the 17th century or earlier. We don't know what. I mean, the population, for instance, in the case of Morocco, is somehow perceived as a subaltern, category in terms of historiography, in terms of official history. So I think it's very important to say that these theories have brought new perspectives, but it is also important to say that this project itself is historically contextualized, and this project now are finished. So my next question would be, then what kind of social sciences do we need now in order to reflect the importance of locality, the importance of nations, of southern perspectives, but the importance also of a global perspective as well. So where should we look to in order to apprehend in a better way the future?
I don't know, that's a big question, but what I note is, it is almost as if Lyotard, when he wrote his famous book on the postmodern condition, on the, so if we can move for a short bit from post-colonialism to postmodernism, on the decline of grand narratives, he didn't seem to have realized himself how accurately he would end up describing academia, which now lacks such grand narratives. They seem to be no great new schools of thought that seek to explain everything, or indeed that even if they do not seek to explain anything, that dominate their respective fields. So in a way, I wonder whether the attacks on post-colonialism, mythical though they might be, that is to say mythical because what they take to be post-colonialism is entirely a figment of the critic's imagination, that these attacks, as it was set up, a school of thought that does not in fact exist. It is a mirage, it is a specter. And that only becomes possible, I think, because we live in a time where such schools of thought in fact do not exist, neither on one side nor on the other. I mean, the attempts to whip up some semblance of a now dead way of thinking, whether it is the triumphalist story of the West, or some other story about the rise of the East or Asia or something. These are all dead narratives from the past. And they're all like specters stalking the stage of modern history and of the modern university, whereas in fact nothing of the sort really exists, neither intellectually nor politically. What I have found useful is, I mean, I was always interested in intellectual history, which is what I did. That was my PhD. So I've always been interested in ideas and how ideas travel, and not necessarily geographically by being handed on from person to person, but how they actually survive. They're the great survivors of history. The moments, the economic and other conditions, political conditions that made them possible might have disappeared, but the ideas tend to live on and multiply and metastasize and go in different places. So I've always been interested in that, and no more so than now, because I think whether it is in the form of intellectual history or political or religious thought, it's through these ideas which have become often quite detached from any original context that produced them, that new movements arise and flourish for a time. And they do so in a way that no longer, it seems to me, draws that much distinction between locality and the global. So an idea might have a very specific meaning in a specific place, but it can also have other kinds of meaning, the same idea elsewhere. So, are we in a situation where the emergence and transportation of these ways of thinking and the practices of acting that go along often with them can no longer be easily classified and named as being either local or global, as being either Eastern or Western, or any of the old categories that we have historically depended upon. So that is one kind of problem that interests me. I certainly don't have a school of thought to propose that seeks to, in a Hegelian or Marxist or some other way, explain everything, or even a Levi-Straussian way. That might have been one of the last moments, structuralism, where we see an intellectual form that seeks to explain the world itself. And that too, structuralism, to go back to an earlier point of our conversation, had been quite influential on subaltern studies. I mean, the founder of subaltern studies, Ranajit Guha, one of his early books is called The Elementary Structures of Peasant Insurgency. The reference, of course, is to Levi-Strauss, The Elementary Structures of Kinship. So like Foucault himself, who was accused of being a structuralist, they move from structuralism to post-structuralism, which is another example of how what comes to be called post-colonialism does not actually fit into any single conceptual framework. It was always quite agile and mobile. And I mentioned this so as to make it exemplary of the kind of thing that I'm trying to describe as intellectual history or political thought or even religious thought. It's able to shift from here to there without being easily classified. So that poses a kind of problem and an obstacle, but also, I think, a great opportunity. Perhaps we have, for the time being, moved away from the period, from the era of great schools of thought which seek universal purchase. We are in another we're in another kind of world in which thought operates differently, or at least excludes these older modes of intellectual inquiry which sought to master everything.
Yeah, that's it is clear that we have no more grand narratives, even if people want to follow grand narrative, even if they have to invent new ones, or want to be faithful to the old ones, even if they are presented in new ways, with these, discourses on identity, or all these discourses that are emerging from social networks, following cultural or religious lines, but also political lines that are sometimes conservative, and that establish a sort of mythical relationship with history. I mean, history is fantasized, subject to nostalgia or this kind of things. You read the role of the structuralists in the formation of the subaltern theories, but what I found out during my own researches is that structural anthropology itself borrowed from the hard sciences, this notion of structuralism, Levi-Strauss, empty space, the religious manna, or the Arabic baraka, that could take different meanings, everything and its opposite. Well, if you search a little bit on the history of sciences, you will find that it's a mathematical thing, and the invention of the zero, as Indian innovation, Arab Indian innovation, the invention of, and the zero as a space that is very useful, and zero is infinite or of vacuity, So it's very interesting to see that there is always relations between different ideas, between culture, even if you want to specify a particular school of thought, whether in the Western world or in the Asian world, you see that these links are, always there, and this shows or see in a certain manner that what is the difficulty today is dealing with the plurality, with the complexity, and the grand narrative are unable to deal with complexity, even the grand religious narratives. And what seems to me very interesting in my own work on sociology, anthropology of religions, I see that, you know, the monotheistic religions are relatively intolerant towards diversity or complexity or, you know, multiplicity. Meanwhile, you know, polytheist religions, animism, and this kind of heterodox religious conceptions are far more at ease with complexity, with multiplicity. So maybe we need a little bit of this kind of spirit in today's world, where at the same time we have an explosion of knowledge. It's also, we are living the golden time of science and knowledge. I mean, we have a profusion of sciences, of theories, of knowledge, and it's an element of, you know, it's a fantastic opportunity, but we are not equipped mentally to deal with multiplicity. So I think, yeah, perhaps we should be more modest in the way to approach these our world. That the challenge is to deal with this plurality and also to not give up the quest for universality also, huh? Because sometimes we go towards plurality, but we stop. We are giving up the idea of universality. So this is the tension that we have to deal with. You wrote on the I read several papers from you, but I have read in detail one book from you, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political ID. And this book impressed me in many ways, very rich. And I wanted to, because this idea of Muslim Zion is quite provocative, and I wanted to discuss with you this idea, how you have reached the point to define this notion of Muslim Zion, because even Muslims can be very skeptical about this way of naming things, because we mentioned the problem of naming things. But I think that heuristically it can provide an explanation of what is happening today. But first of all, what do you mean by this notion of Muslim Zion, and what is its continuation in today's world?
Yeah, you know, the title, I mean, I thought it sounded like a nice provocative title, which would inspire people to look at the book in more detail. But what seems to have happened, especially in countries like Pakistan, is that, you know, people just look at the title and are, you know, they take what they understand to be the title as being the argument of the book itself. So rather than serving as an invitation to the book, it actually, in some ways, even prevents people from opening the book, which was not my point at all. So what people tend to think is that I'm drawing a parallel, that the book is about, you know, pointing out a parallel history between the emergence of Pakistan and the emergence of Israel as states defined for minority populations, minority religious populations from two subcontinents, the European subcontinent, if you will, Western Europe, and in the initial instance, and the Indian subcontinent for Muslims. You know, that there's a huge migration and a huge transformation in which a minority becomes a majority. Well, there's something to that, in the sense that Israel and Pakistan did emerge within a year of each other, and the creation of Pakistan on the basis of, if you will, not religion, but a religious minority population, became the, as it were, legal precedent justifying the creation of Israel at the United Nations. So there are these kinds of links, but that was not, in fact, my argument. These were just very nice coincidental links. And there are other links of that sort, which other scholars have written about, how the figure of the minority was represented in Western Europe after a certain point by Jews. Jews as the quintessential religious minority spread across Europe with no majority population anywhere. What are we to do with this kind of minority? Unlike Catholics and Protestants, who might be minorities in some countries but were majorities in others, the Jews were the quintessential minority. They were only a minority. And this idea of a minority was to some degree transposed in colonial times upon other groups in other parts of the world, including Muslims in India. So there is a sort of contextual history that links European Jews with Indian Muslims and the establishment of Israel with that of Pakistan. But that was not, in fact, the argument of my book, which is why it's called Muslim Zion and not Muslim Zionism. So Zion is, as it were, a Christian recension of a Jewish trope. And what I argue in my book is that you can look at the establishment of New World states in the Americas, for instance, as these forms of, if you will, Zion, the making of a new kind of Zion, or the achievement of a new kind of Zion. So this sort of biblical trope gets mobilized politically through Christianity, not through Judaism, and is dispersed throughout the world in movements of conquest and exploration, and especially the New World. So what interested me is how Pakistani nationalism in particular drew not upon European ideas of nationality, which were based in romanticism and in the attachment, mythical though it might be, of a deeply rooted history occurring within a specified geography. And the interesting thing about Pakistan is that the Pakistan movement cared almost nothing for history and geography. Ties of blood and land were of very little consequence. It was much more like a New World form, not a romantic, but an Enlightenment form of nation making or state making, where it is, as it were, a purely reasonable, rational, or viable, where the state and the nation attached to it were understood in terms, were defined in terms of rationality and viability, rather than in terms of language and history and blood and these kinds of connections. So Pakistan would exist wherever there were enough Muslims to sustain it. It could be anywhere. And in some ways, Israel, there's a prehistory of Israel and of Zionism, which also includes this way of thinking. So Herzl, the founder of Zionism, thought that you could actually have a Jewish state in, say, Uganda or Madagascar, and there were attempts to do so in Russia as well, despite the fact that Jerusalem had been so important for Jewish thought. So what I was trying to do was to actually suggest that Pakistan, the first state founded for, as it were, a Muslim population, and a minority population at that, should be placed within a model of nation making or state making that is not European and that is not romantic, but that draws upon ideas from the Enlightenment, and that is much more like New World forms of state making, that depends upon ideas of mobility, movement, rationality, and viability, and therefore about being freed from the shackles and the bonds of belonging, of blood, and of history, not of returning to them, which is the way in which we normally think about nationalism in a romantic form. That would have been Indian nationalism, as it were. You know, the inheritance of a historic homeland to which its citizens or subjects are tied by long histories of memory and blood and belonging. Whereas for Pakistan, it could happen anywhere. And it was not dependent upon a language of long memory and history. On the contrary, it was dominated by ideas of making something anew, of starting something absolutely new, of a kind of future orientation. And that is why, like a number of New World countries, Pakistan was also founded in two separate pieces. You know, land and historical memory just could not play a role there. You know, it was, as you know, founded with a Western wing, what is today Pakistan, and an Eastern wing, what is today Bangladesh, separated by 1,000 miles of India. What kind of nation state is this? Exactly. But you see this happening in the United States, you know, where Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Alaska, which are separated from the body of the United States, the main part of it, are still part of this, this new state. Imperial states also work in this way, dispersed in different parts, in the way that Algeria was understood as being part of France, but of course was not geographically part of France. It was separated by the Mediterranean. So there are all these ways in which it became, you know, it becomes possible to think the nation anew. And that was really what my title was referring to. Indeed, the reference was the historical genealogy dealt not only with the Americas and with the United States of America in particular, but also with the return to the old world of this, if you will, Enlightenment vision of politics through the creation of Liberia as a state for ex-slaves from America, from the United States. So, you know, here you have, again, a racialized minority who it is imagined will roil the history of the United States as a nation, and therefore need to be displaced, both for their own good, these ex-slave populations, but also for the good of the white citizens of the United States. And so they need a state of their own. And lo and behold, they return to Africa. And Liberia is created as a state for them, with all the implications of settler colonialism, because of course there were people living there who did not much appreciate being put under the governorship of ex-slaves from the United States, supported by white Americans. Right? So in a way, Liberia in the middle of the 19th century serves as a nice precedent, both for Israel eventually, and for Pakistan in different ways. These are not the same histories, but these are histories which tell us about the creation of new nation states, often in the name of minorities who need to become majorities. But these are nation states whose links with immemorial traditions and land and blood and all the rest are weak. In Israel and in Liberia, you can pretend that there is some immemorial tradition, even though that tradition is there only in books and in rituals. In Pakistan, you cannot pretend this. And in that sense, Pakistan is, you know, the name Pakistan means land of the pure. And it is pure in this sense, that it is perhaps the most, apart from the United States itself, the most important example of an enlightenment state, ironically, created out of nothing for a population that could be moved about with no connection to a rhetoric or a nationalism based on blood and soil and immemorial traditions and all the rest. It was made for the future, just like the United States was made for the future. It was not made in the name of the past. So these are a number of the themes which, for me, were encapsulated by this name, Muslim Zion. And now, sadly, among a number of people, these themes have been neglected, so that my references to the Americas and to Liberia and all the rest have been set aside, and only the comparison with Israel is brought to the fore over and over again, even though that was not my point. That is certainly part of the story, but it is not the whole part of the story. And there is no parallel history between Pakistan and Israel in that sense. The history I was interested in was a global history, the history of the making of an enlightenment state. What does it look like? Where does it come into being? And so Pakistan, and to some degree Israel, are part of this international history. They're not exceptions, is what I was trying to say. And in doing so, to suggest that Pakistan had its own take on the story of the nation state. It was not simply a miniaturized version of India. It was not simply India's alternative. Its history was not simply a regional history. It was a global history. So that, anyway, was the ambition of the book. And there are other things in there as well, which do not entirely fit the story, because there are specificities to the story of Pakistan also. Not everything about it can be identified as, within the story of the making of an enlightenment state, and what that might mean. But that project certainly forms the carapace of my narrative. And in particular, through the figure of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, who was so explicit in his references to this way of thinking. He thought what he was doing was, for the first time in the history of the world, making real and fulfilling a social contract, creating a state, indeed two states, India and Pakistan, through a social contract of the kind that European thinkers, from Thomas Hobbes to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, had only imagined in theory. Jinnah thought he was actually making that theory into a reality for the first time, because these two states are created by a set of negotiations between civilian leaders. They are not created through war. They are not created by a kind of external action. They are created by people themselves, in his view. And he thought that this was the greatest achievement that India and Pakistan both had to offer the world. They had made real what Europe had only imagined, and done so in a different way. It was not simply a derivation of Europe, because European states are not founded in this manner, as we know. So I thought this book would explore these ways of thinking and the politics they gave rise to, in addition to focusing on more specific matters having to do with the meaning of Islam, the future of Islam as a cultural and political force, and such questions which continue to be questions for us today globally.
Yeah, this title, this notion of Muslim Zion, which looks very provocative at the first sight, for me is very relevant, and I have been influenced by your book in a way that I will mention right now, is that in fact you have enlarged this notion of Zion as some of the creation of a state, a modern state, out of nothing, out of a historical, geographical context, and it's an ideal that is concretized. It's a new form of state, a secular state. We will come back later to this in a moment, to this notion of secular regarding Pakistan, but one or two other countries in the region. But it's a new form of state, and for me it was very indicative of what is happening, what happened during the last 40 years with the the advent of what we may call the Islamic revival, the political expression of Islamism, if you want, or the Muslim Brotherhood. And I mean, this idea that Islam could be a project, a social political project for today's world. And for me, it may be also a second level of provocative thinking, but this notion of Muslim Zion may describe what this messianic quest for an Islamic state. An Islamic, you have worked on jihad, on Islam militancy, etc. But this idea of an Islamic state out of nothing, it could be located in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in the Sahel. It is not so much important. What is important is to have this ideal maintained and concretized somewhere. And even this somewhere could be in the cyberspace. It could be a digital ummah and a digital Islamic state. But I think it's a danger for the Muslim activists to I mean, this idea can be dangerous, but to be honest, the comparison with Zion is really relevant. And we do not forget that the creation of Israel, before Israel, of the national Jewish state, was immediately accompanied with the encouragement of an Arab state in today's Saudi Arabia region. So the focus to create a national state with Jerusalem somewhere as a capital, and another one with Mecca as a sort of capital, already is very ambivalent, because those states should normally be secular, but they are relying on religious belonging. So I think this heuristically, it's very, very fecund idea, because we can see that what we see as a Islamic revival is something really new, and totally, it's a new form of thinking states, and even if it's provocative, it may help us to think what is happening today around this quest for an Islamic state. So. And what is interesting also is to see that in this Muslim Zion that you described as in the example of Pakistan, these two states, India, Pakistan, were in fact secular states. So I wanted to have your views about this notion of secularism today, but from a non-European perspective, because Europeans are very centered around their own historical experience. But it is important to see, for instance, in the case of Muslim societies from Africa or from Asia, that, well, states, the states after the political independence were secular. So I wanted to hear you about this, the secularization that took place in India, in Pakistan, maybe also in Turkey, the evolution during the last 40, 50 years, and what can be learned from these 2 or 3 countries?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a big question, but, I suppose I would start by saying that, unlike in countries like France or even Turkey for that matter, the Ottoman Empire is a different story, and we can come to that. But if you look at the nation states of France and Turkey, and there are other European countries one can look at profitably, the debate about secularism in South Asia, for instance, is rarely about the relationship between the state on the one hand and a church or some kind of religious community on the other. In part because there is no single great religious body. First of all, there are no church. I mean, obviously there are churches in countries like India and Pakistan, but they are among the most minor, demographically speaking, communities in the country. So neither Hinduism nor Islam is organized, of course, institutionally in terms of church-like forms. So unlike in Europe, there is no institution to be dealt with its authoritative expounders and heads. You cannot sign a concordat as the Catholic Church can sign with countries, because there's no one to sign such a document with. That's for one thing. The other thing is there are many more religious groups in these countries. So the problem is not that of defining the relationship between the state and religion on the one hand, and those who are without religion on the other, but the problem poses itself in this manner. How is it possible for different religious groups to live together on the one hand and be treated equally by the state on the other? So in a way, secularism is conceived in South Asia in social terms, not in political or in state-like terms. The state is only meant to treat all religious groups equally. It is not meant to, and historically, there has been very little emphasis placed on defining the line that separates the state from religion. Officials of the state can engage with religious groups in all kinds of ways. The problem is not the engagement. The problem is that if they engage with one religious group in such a manner, they must do the same for other religious groups. So the problem is the equal treatment of different religions and of people who belong to no religion. The problem is not phrased in terms of the relationship between the state on the one hand and society or religion or church on the other. So I think that's a crucial distinction to make, which is why secularism in countries like India and to some degree Pakistan and Bangladesh as well is spoken of very often as a kind of, in its social aspect within society. It doesn't necessarily even reference the state or the role of the state. The role of the state is simply to treat everyone equally. there are no lines drawn as to whether a state official can go to a church or a temple or a mosque. The implication being that if the president or prime minister goes to a temple or a mosque or a church, he or she must do so to other religious sites as well. They cannot discriminate between religions. So to belabor the point, it's a fundamentally different context in which the term secularism comes to play a role. And it's what the Indian political philosopher Rajiv Bhargava calls the principal distance. So that the state, on the one hand, secularism gets to be the name for the mutual and equal relations between people belonging to different religious groups. Right? On the other hand, it serves to define the relationship between the state and different religious groups, a relationship that is premised upon the equal treatment of different religious groups. So in both cases, it is the equality of religions that is the issue. It is not really the relationship between the state and religion. And that is because of the religious plurality of South Asia, which was not true of Europe, of many European countries, until immigration became important for them. And even then, immigrants belonging to non-Christian faiths do not account for that greater percentage of any European country's population. Nevertheless, they seem to cause a crisis in their very presence seems to imply a crisis in the idea of the secular that has defined those states. And what I wonder is whether, despite all its manifold problems, the way in which secularism has been conceptualized outside Europe, say in South Asia, in irredeemably pluralistic terms, whether that's actually a better way of thinking about it than the old European model of church and state, which makes no sense any longer in countries which are religiously plural. The laws of secularism, as they were formulated in countries like France, were formulated at a time when there was very little religious plurality. It was simply the church and the state, the Catholic Church, basically, and the state, in which everyone was actually born a Catholic, whether they were from the state or from the church. This has never been the case in South Asia, and it is increasingly not the case in Europe either. So, this is the context of secularism in countries like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Now, interestingly, in India, when the constitution was formulated in 1950, secularism did not find a place in it. And it did not find a place in the constitution because the Prime Minister of India, Nehru, and others realized that to put secularism in the constitution would be counterproductive, or could be counterproductive, because it would force upon religious minorities very often certain kinds of strictures. It could be used as a stick to beat people with, people who were weak, right? Minority groups in particular. Eventually, secularism is put into the constitution by Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, in the 1970s. So secularism was very, very important in public debate, but it was not necessarily made part of constitutional law. An interesting fact. Now, with Pakistan, the point was, as with India, how do you treat different religious groups equally? How the state should treat them equally on the one hand, and how they themselves should interact with each other on equal terms. That was the problem of secularism. And what Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, had imagined was that by splitting British India into two pieces, or three, because East and West Pakistan were separate pieces, as I described earlier, the problem of the minority would disappear. that what you would have is established religious minorities in both countries, Hindus in India and Muslims in Pakistan, majorities that were not threatened by minority religions. And in such a situation, religion would cease to be a political issue and would subside into the everyday lives of people and would not define their politics in the way it had come to define Indian politics in late colonial times. When it's Hindus and Muslims, but also Sikhs in some places, who ended up becoming the major, or giving their names to the major political movements of the day. So it was precisely because Jinnah thought this was a problem that he understood partition as being its solution. How do you get rid of the absolute dominance of religious categories in political life? Well, by actually separating them out in some way. And he had a very naive understanding, it seems to me, or a very idealistic, to put it more positively, understanding of history. He often used to say that the problem of Hindu-Muslim conflict, but this is interesting, was a problem not of their alienation from each other, but of the fact that they were too close to each other, they were too intimate with each other. That hatred can only come from a situation of intimacy. This idea that you're being betrayed by the other can only emerge if you think this other person is in fact your brother. You're being betrayed. You can only be betrayed by your own brother or your friend. You can't be betrayed by a stranger, right? So what Jinnah thought was that Hindus and Muslims are so intertwined historically and in all kinds of other ways that their relationship had become toxic, like the relationship of two brothers. And he often used to say that just as he, as a lawyer, had very often to divide up the inheritance of two brothers who had come to blows once the father had died, so too he would divide the Hindus and Muslims in order to turn brothers into friends. So once the paternal inheritance is divided, the fighting brothers can become friends. So you move away from the intimacy which is toxic and which only results in feelings of betrayal, to friendship which is voluntary and which allows you to work together. So it's an interesting way of thinking, but as I said, I think it is fairly naive. And it certainly did not work in the sense that Jinnah meant it to work. That the separation of Hindus and Muslims into neighboring countries, each with its own religious majority, did not solve the problem of religious conflict in either country. It internationalized the problem, because now Hindu-Muslim conflict happened across international lines, but it also domesticated it by making the minority group in either country into a target. But it was certainly an interesting conception, and I have no idea whether it ever had a chance of succeeding. Perhaps had partition occurred and been managed in such a way as to prevent the devastating violence that resulted from it, which Jinnah had not expected, which no one had expected. Had that violence not occurred, perhaps his idea would have had a chance. I don't know. But in either case, what I'm suggesting is that there is a prehistory of the idea of secularism, which has to do with the idea of plurality, which takes religious plurality as its basis and its context, and for which the equal treatment and the equality of religions, of different religious groups, is the issue, not the relationship between the state and religion. And that the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan was meant to solve the problem of religious conflict, the conflict between religions, not the power of religion over the state, or the relationship of the state to religion. So it's a history that, as you can see, is related to European debates about secularism, but also quite different, also quite distinct and unique. And in this way, South Asia offers us another narrative of the secular and its problems as well as its opportunities, whereas Turkey is much more like France and other European countries in the way in which it has been informed by secularism as a category.
Yeah, it's very instructive to have such a historical approach, because we tend to see secularism or secularization. I prefer this term because for me it's a more process than a state of things, as something that distinguishes states from spiritual or religious matters, but in these examples we might see things differently when we can see that secularization is a sort of universal process that defines the relationship between a religion or religions within us plural with the state, but according to different historical pattern. For example, in France, we tend to think that, well, the French laïcité is a kind of neutrality, but in reality, French secularism, it reflects the dominance of one religion, the Catholic Church. And in fact, when we see the French public holidays, all are, Catholic holidays. So we can see clearly that the French laïcité is directly connected to its religious past. And we have other examples, such as the former USSR, where atheism was a kind of state religion, or even in China, where the secularization is a little bit against the religious currents. Meanwhile, in the case of South Asia, you tend to see that secularization happens as a way to deal with religious pluralism. So it's very, very interesting to see these differences, to see that there is not a university of definition or perception of this notion. In your book on Pakistan, you mentioned an idea that I found also very, very interesting. You mentioned the idea that the Muslim was perceived in India before the partition as a kind in a society that is not so much dominated by social or economic distinctions, but by castes, was sometimes perceived as a mediator, or for instance, the relation between the different castes. I mean, and you mentioned an example of Mahatma Gandhi, mentioning that the role of the Muslim as being to purify some object polluted by a Dalit. So the idea that the Muslim can be a mediator between different categories of population that are, in a very hierarchical, we have, sorry to say that, but it's clearly the case in the system of castes. I found that this system also in the Syrian countries. I was extremely surprised to see until now the importance of in the mental representation, the importance of castes. And for me, well, the idea that the Muslims, that the Muslim agent or the Muslim individual could be actor could be perceived as a sort of mediator. I find it very interesting because, for instance, in the case of the Sahelian countries, I did a research on radicalization and violent extremism, and the jihadist groups are perceived there as forces that are threatening citizenship. But when you see more in detail in some Sahelian region that citizenship could not happen within the system of caste, you can see that these new forms of what I call Islamic revival, political Islam, jihadists, etc., these groups tend to, on the contrary, encourage the notion of citizenship, equality between all individuals, and rejecting all kind of social barrier, cultural barriers and impediments. So I wanted to know more about this idea of mediator and how it could be also generalized or enlarged to describe the role of Islam, as a political actor. Since the end of the Cold War, Islam is presented as a metaphysical enemy of the West, and it's a structural antagonism. I mean, it's useful to have this kind of metaphysical enemy within the international global order. So, yeah, how do you see Islam, or Islam as a category, or the Muslim as a mediator in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's, I mean, as far as caste is concerned, of course, Muslims can serve as mediators, but they also often have their own castes as well. And so they can, at one and the same time, fall into caste identities, but also exist outside them, which Hindus cannot do in this particular sense. And indeed, the role of the mediator historically has occasioned great anxiety, because if one Hindu caste can interact with another, as it were, only through the mediation of the Muslim, that means that Hindus are split up. They are no longer to be conceived of as a majority. And so you can see that this kind of religious conflict, which emerged probably around the middle of the 19th century, has embedded at its very center these very modern European terms like majority and minority, which are demographic terms, obviously, that come to characterize these groups only after the operations of census taking by the colonial state. And these are, of course, terms that belong to potential and actual nation states. Majorities and minorities don't have much meaning outside the nation state, unless it is in non-political ways. When you're talking about, since we're speaking at the time of pandemic, who has been infected, how many have been infected and how many not, and who belongs to those populations and who does not. But in general, in terms of political identities, majorities and minorities, of course, are both part of democratic politics on the one hand and nation state politics on the other, because they can name ethnic groups or religious groups, but also political groups, which are meant to be temporary. So a democratic majority today might be a minority tomorrow. And the problem in South Asia was always, and this is how Jinnah described it, that the religious majority and minority would end up constituting the political majority and minority, which meant that rather than, as in a democracy, you have majorities and minorities changing, depending on different interests and different contexts, they would remain permanent. And this was the problem. So you had to, the partition of India was meant to separate out the religious from the political and allow for the changing of majorities and minorities according to electoral politics. So, but in the meantime, from the 19th century, this idea of a majority and a minority had been deeply embedded within the religious sensibility of Hindus and Muslims and other groups. So that today people routinely describe themselves as majority or minority in these countries. And the arrival and importance of these terms, which are modern demographic, census-driven terms, which also make sense in a nation-state context, potential or actual, the role of mediation was increasingly put into question because it was crucial to make the Hindus into a majority. And in order to do that, you have to get rid of the mediator because the mediator interrupts the majority. So even though mediation continues to exist, it is increasingly seen as more and more problematic, whether for Hindus or for Muslims or for anyone else. So that's the first thing I would like to say about the issue of caste. Now, what's interesting, secondly, is that, again, confining myself to South Asia for the moment, in India, the diversity of caste and the conflicts of caste exist alongside the diversity and context of religion. And the two things overlap, but are not identical. All right? So very often the diversity and conflicts of caste within Hinduism are displaced onto the figure of the Muslim or the Christian as an external religious minority. So you can unify Hindus into a majority by scapegoating Muslims or Christians as religious minorities who are outside the fold of Hinduism. So Hindus become a majority community only by way of contrast with religious minorities like Muslims and Christians. So the problem of caste, which is internal, is displaced onto the problem of religion, which is external. But in Pakistan, something else is happening. Because interestingly, in Pakistan, the religious minority targeted is never or very rarely the non-Muslim. It is always within Islam. It is the Ahmadiyya or the Shias or the Barelvis or the Deobandis. There are a number of claimants to this status. So in Pakistan, the problem of the religious minority is internal to Islam. It's not external. Whereas non-Muslims like Christians and Hindus are treated like castes, are discriminated against on the basis of caste rather than religion. So Hindus of low caste who converted to Christianity are treated as low castes, not as Christians or Hindus. Hindus who are of merchant caste are treated as such, etc. Right? So there's an interesting inversion. On the one hand, there is a parallelism between caste hierarchy and religious hierarchy, caste violence and religious violence, where there's an overlap but not identity, and there's a displacement. On the other hand, what's happening is that in India, the displacement occurs from caste to religion, from the internal problem of caste hierarchy to the external problem of religious difference. In Pakistan, the religious difference is internal to Islam, and it is the caste difference that is displaced onto non-Muslims. So it's almost a kind of topsy-turvy, a reflection of what's happening in India, which is interesting. But as far as kind of speaking about Islam globally is concerned, I mean, there's a long history, as you know, of the idea of Islam as a mediator. on the one hand, in the Mediterranean basin, this figure of Islam as mediating classical Greek and Roman texts and philosophy to the Christian West through projects of translation, etc. That's a well-known history. On the other hand, of course, outside the Mediterranean basin, the figure of Islam or of Muslims is mediating again between the West or Christianity and other religions. Because Muslims and Islam are interesting historically before the period of imperialism, because they were, if I'm not mistaken, the only religious group that connected the others to each other. That if you were in Christian Europe, you had to go through Islam and through the world of Islam to get to Hinduism and Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, and the reverse. The figure of Islam and of the Muslim world was an inevitable figure of mediation, both in a positive sense, as with the translation projects and all, but also in a negative sense, because just as I've described for India, the mediator can also be a problematic figure, because the mediator is one who is seen as interrupting your direct relationship with the other. So if you want a direct relationship between the Hindu and the Christian, or India and the West, you need to get rid of Islam. So the figure of mediation works in both senses. But again, what I think is crucial here is that Islam or the Muslim world has had its own long history before colonialism of relations with Buddhists, Eastern Christians, Orthodox Christians mostly, Hindus, and others, well before Western Europeans had any connection with them. And very often, Western Europeans could only come to have a connection with them through the world of Islam, through Arabic and Persian and Turkish texts, through translators, and by going through the world of Islam to get to these places. So we know the explorations of the journeys of Christopher Columbus, are meant to circumvent the Muslim world, to circumvent the world of Islam in order to get to the Indies, right? India. He ends up in, of course, the Americas, the West Indies. So even in the spread of Europe, you have the importance of the Muslim mediator. Either you make use of that mediator, you try to circumvent that mediator, to get rid of the mediation altogether. So in both positive and negative ways, Islam has, because of its historical and geographical situation, has played this role of connector. It is the only world, as it were, world religion that connects all the others to one another. There is no other group or religiously designated geography has done that historically. And I think it is a fascinating story. There are translation projects in the West, in Muslim Spain, and in North Africa, and in the Mashrek, which are about Greek, etc. And there are translation projects in the East, where Sanskrit texts or Western texts of Zoroastrianism are translated into Persian and Arabic. So on both sides of the Islamic world, you have similar forms of intellectual and religious and political mediation, to say nothing of economic mediation going on. And the question is that mediation to be valued, or is it to be rejected?
The last topic that I wanted to discuss with you today was about around the figure of an intellectual, Muhammad Iqbal. We have both worked on Muhammad Iqbal, and we We value his intellectual contribution. Muhammad Iqbal is considered as the spiritual father of Pakistan, but he was born in the 19th century. He studied in England and Germany, I think, and he died 10 years before the creation of Pakistan. So when I refer personally to him in my writings, I mention it as the Indian philosopher. Muhammad Iqbal. But what is very interesting with this figure, he's a great poet, شاعر الشرق. He wrote in different languages. He's a philosopher, but also he played a role in the conscience of Muslim Indian, in the national consciousness, and he wrote a book, The Reconstruction of the Religious Thought in Islam, which is a small book made of a series of conferences. But with this book only, he was already considered as the most important philosopher of Islam for the past century. So what, according to you, what is relevant in the project of Muhammad Iqbal, the philosophical project? Because what is very interesting with him is that he's someone who's oriented towards the future, and so I wanted to know what are the ideas that, according to you, could be followed for us in the 21st century. His attempt to reconcile Islam and modernity, comparing philosophy of Islam with philosophy of sciences, and all these kind of approaches. So what is the relevance of this of the philosophical work of Muhammad Iqbal today?
Well, again, another big question, which you are, perhaps better able to answer than I am, but there are many things. I mean, I think one of the useful things about Iqbal is, okay, he's an important thinker because he's one of the few fully trained philosophers of his time from the East, trained in the West. But and also he is very interested in approaching modernity as an idea and as a reality intellectually, rather than through gadgets or through material objects. For him, modernity is not defined by technology, the modern technology of armaments and steam engines and things like that, which were, of course, the things that were of most interest to Muslim rulers in the 18th and 19th centuries, because they posed a threat and an opportunity for them. So they're perfectly understandable. But for Iqbal wanted to go beyond technology to understand what animated it and what made it so important for the West and for the rest of the world. And like his contemporary Gandhi, he tied technology, of course, to industrial capitalism, and industrial capitalism to violence of a very deep kind. And he saw the West and Christianity in particular as being the first victim of this violence. That modernity, the kind of modern person produced in a world defined by industrial capitalism and its technology, a technology that went on to conquer large parts of the world, the rest of the world, that form of modernity was not only harmful for the sovereignty and freedom of non-European peoples, its first victim was in fact Europe itself, according to Iqbal, like Gandhi. And Iqbal in his poetry describes very vividly how the stature, the physical stature and glory of banks have eclipsed the glory of churches in Europe, for instance. Right? So the new world of capital and technology and conquest represented by modernity was one that had to destroy all European ideals first, and in particular Christian ideals, before it went on to destroy those of other people. So the task of decolonization was the task, first of all, of saving not, it was not anti-European in that sense. It was meant to save Europe itself from itself. It was meant to save Christianity itself. So in this sense, Islam or Hinduism for Gandhi and the forms of anti-imperialism that they championed were not anti-European. They were inclusive, they were not exclusive. And they were dedicated to understanding modernity in a critical way and not simply to refusing it and returning to some kind of past. So Iqbal was very clear, and much more than Gandhi, he has a tragic sense of the modern, right? That this is not something you can, as it were, turn away easily. You have to go through it in some fashion. But what do you do with it? How do you go through it? How do you understand it for what it is? And he brings to bear on the question of modernity. He makes it both an intellectual and an existential question, which is why for Iqbal, the task of modern Islam, but this is not only the task of Islam, it could be of it could be of Hinduism, of Buddhism, and indeed of non-religious ideas as well, was to produce new kinds of individuals. And he used the term khudi, selfhood. For him, you needed to produce a new kind of person who was capable of understanding and grappling with the modern as a problem that faces us all. And so his philosophy is about making or remaking the individual, which I think is very, very interesting. In so doing, he, I think, broaches a great many very interesting perspectives. You know, for instance, I wrote last year or a couple of years ago an article on how Iqbal thinks about the secular, the figure of secularism, in which I point out that, you know, he notices how European ideas of secularism are so based on spatiality, on space. How do you separate things in space, right? Where you can be religious in your private life, perhaps in your home, and where you cannot be religious. You know, where your religious categories have meaning, again, in a church, in a temple or a mosque, or in your home, and where they cannot have meaning, right? And he talks about how this obsession with space really is sometimes beside the point. First of all, these spatial divisions are impossible to really enforce, because how can you cut yourself into spatial pieces like this? They destroy the very individual that Iqbal wants to develop. And they end up in rehearsing the problem of religion over and over again, because this kind of policing of space is impossible and destructive. But also it is too superficial in his view. So he experiments with thinking about the secular in temporal terms, in terms of time rather than space. And as you know, Iqbal was very interested in time because he was interested in Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, who was a thinker of time and of temporality. And Iqbal wrote about Bergson a lot and wrote about his idea of pure duration. So what does Iqbal say? He says, look, if you think about Muslim ways of considering what today you would call the secular, you see how they're often structured in temporal rather than spatial terms. Right? So he offers two examples, which are very interesting. One is a Sunni example out of Islam. He says, look, the finality of prophecy, the fact that Muhammad is meant to be the last prophet, entails the freedom of human beings from theological categories and domination. Because with the end of prophecy, what you have opened up is the future, or modernity, you can call it that, as a site of human freedom, no longer governed by any living theological authority. It is a site of freedom because Muslims can reflect upon the religious authority of Muhammad and reflect upon the Quran and other texts. But they are free beings. They can only do so as free. They are not dominated by the theological. So this is one way in which time structures, if you will, the secular, the distinction of what is religion and what is not, what is theological authority and what is not. And the second example he gives is a Shiite example, in which the temporal caesura is moved to the future. So he argues because the Shia believe in the return of the Imam who is in hiding, a messianic return. So until the Imam returns at the end of time, no absolute religious authority is permissible, because only the Imam can exercise such an authority. It would be sinful to create a perfect religious society or perfect religious state in the absence of the Imam. Such a thing is impossible. And so until the Imam returns, what we have is the present and the future as a site of human freedom. So you see, from the Sunni angle, it is the finality of prophecy which creates the future, the present and the future, as a site of human freedom. And from the Shiite angle, it is the non-presence of the Imam that creates the present and the future as a site of human freedom. And so he offers this as a kind of experimental suggestion, as a way of thinking through tradition about what you could call secularism. How do you distinguish between what is governed by religious authority and what is not? Where freedom can be located and where it is not. And he starts off with this spatial model of Christian European thought, and he moves to what he describes as an Islamic model, which is based not on space but on time, and which does not have to exclude the theological in order to work. So now he doesn't elaborate this into any, juridical way of thinking about the issue. That is not his aim. But it's a very, in my view, interesting experiment, because it allows us a new perspective onto the debate over secularism in the Christian West, and at the same time offers us another way of thinking about the distinction between religion and non-religion, authority and freedom. And for him, of course, philosophy, like poetry, was a site, inevitably the site of human freedom. He would have liked politics to be a site of freedom as well, which it was not in his time, because he lived in colonial times. He was a colonized subject. And so he focused, while the political world was not yet available to him, he focused on philosophy and poetry as sites of human freedom, which were important precisely because they allowed for the making or the remaking of the individual, of the new individual that Iqbal's career was dedicated to.
Yeah, these fascinating insights show also that Iqbal's warning about on the dangers of industrial capitalism is more than ever important in a period where there is also an acceleration of time. Anyway, Faisal Devji, thank you very much for this pleasant, instructive, and creative conversation.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to speak with you, Reza.